Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about how to get unstuck and or how to be more creative in any kind of role. I've been coming to these things for a while now. I've met designers, illustrators, writers, dancers, and people who are sometimes all those things. Myself, I am a freelance creative director. I'm a graphic designer by trade. That's how I pay my bills. I also do some other things that maybe don't bring me as much financial reward, but are still pretty fun to do. And then every once in a while, I also do things that don't bring me any money at all, but they're still very important to me. Why would you start a podcast? That's crazy. Most importantly, I consider myself a creative, like many of you. I feel like I'm in pretty good company over here. And when I leave as well, always surrounded by creative people at work or after work. And if there's one thing I learned about creative people is that often we want more freedom. We like to talk about it, we like to fight for it, we like to make things on the web that says how much we love freedom, including making these banana over here that I found just by Google image searching. So my point is maybe we keep asking for all this freedom, but thinking that maybe it will make us more creative when really maybe we shouldn't. Because is freedom going to make us more creative? I don't think so. Maybe we should stop because we're wrong. We're wrong. I don't want you to take it from me. I want you to take it from someone, one of the coolest people I know of, and one of the most prolific creatives that I know. It's Jack White from the White Stripes.
What opportunity and telling yourself, oh, you got all the time in the world, all the money in the world, you got all the colors and the palette you want, anything you want. I mean, that just kills creativity.
So Jack White is telling me that all those things that I want, more money, more time, more colors, kill creativity. That's okay. It makes sense because Jack White, the White Stripes, are a band that has a lot of constrictions. Only two people, only two instruments and vocals. All their artwork is only three colors: red, black, and white. But and yet they make music that I'm sure all of us here love. There's a guy that who's not as cool as Jack White, and his name is George Saunders. He's a writer and a Chicago guy, so of course he'll be a little bit cool at least. He's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner, so he knows a thing or two. He's a great writer of short stories, and I was reading an interview with him not so long ago, and I was shocked to see that he talks about not wanting freedom, about too much freedom being a problem. If anything, he says that if you tell him, well, just write it any way you like about, whatever, and make it wonderful, he's gonna freeze. And I'm like, a genius freezes when given no constraints. I freeze too. Usually it's, don't get me wrong, I get briefs at work that are very constraining and make it very hard to create anything really interesting. But every once in a while, I'm given briefs that are just like, make something cool for this brand of iced tea. And that becomes very hard. And I have a theory about that, and it's that creative people are problem solvers, right? And it's hard when we don't know, it's hard to know that we found a solution when we know what the problem is. So here's an idea, and it's a little counterintuitive, but hear me out. What if I told you that freedom was overrated, right? And I'm talking about in a strict creative sense. I mean, I don't want the NSA to like tap into this and come get the guy with the accent that says, down with freedom. I'm saying like when it comes to inspiration, maybe there's something even better than total creative freedom, and that is constraints. Constraints make us more creative, and maybe when it comes to being stuck, maybe they are the key to making something original. So I want to tell you guys about 3 ways that you can bring constraints into your work. Again, when you're given a brief, usually that comes with their own set of constraints, but especially when it comes to self-directed projects, which I have a few of, sometimes you need them more than ever. The first way to bring constraints into your work is by making things harder on yourself, so that it becomes easier to actually create something original and something that's fun for you. You guys recognize this building, one of the masterpieces of architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright, when he got the plot for this land, he was expected to design a house in front of a waterfall, or maybe with the waterfall in the back. And he took the waterfall and said, no, motherfucker, I'm putting that house on top of that waterfall. And obviously that did not make it easy for him to design it or for him to build it, but now it's the reason why this is one of the most well-known and one of the big masterpieces of architecture. Another thing about it is Frank Lloyd Wright procrastinated for a year before delivering the design, and he only delivered the design because the client called him and saying, hey Frankie, I'm 140 miles away, I'm coming down to see my design. Looking forward to it, bye. And according to the books, Frank Lloyd Wright just took to his desk and drew like a maniac for 2 hours to finally then deliver his piece. So I think that's my tip number 2 is we need deadlines. Nothing will come if you just have all the time in the world. And here's the thing too about deadlines. A lot of times we like to say that, oh, I have a self-imposed deadline. We are awful at keeping deadlines that we give ourselves. We are way too kind and when we miss a deadline, and so that's why I like entering contests a lot, because a film festival or a design award will not give. Usually they don't give extensions, but they will not. They'll give you a date that you have to have it done by, and usually the night before you're finishing it. But you're finishing it. Speaking of constraints that you get from other people, the third and final way that I'm bringing here to make you guys actually finish things and to actually get things off the ground is by being given a challenge by someone else. There's nothing, it's very lucky if we get a dare. I heard many years ago that Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham as the result of a dare. So of course I went to Snopes, which is where you gotta go whenever you hear something crazy going on in 2017. And as it turns out, it's true. Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham as a dare from his editor that he couldn't write a book with less than 50 words. And now half of you can probably remember every word in that book. The Ice Bucket Challenge, of course, it has challenge in the name. And the reason I think was for it to having gone so viral we don't want to disappoint other people. Even more, we want to say, oh yeah, I can do this, and I can do this better than you. And that's why not a month goes by that I don't get a brief that asks for the next Ice Bucket Challenge. Can you just do it for us? So I want to finish with telling you guys about, if it wasn't for a dare, I wouldn't have anything to talk about here tonight. This morning. The opposite of tonight. Obviously I've used all three constraints that I've mentioned here so far. There was a deadline that I had to meet. I couldn't just email the 150 of you and say, hey, I'm not done. Can we just meet up next Friday? I had a self-constraint that I created to make it fun and challenging for myself. Most of you have picked up that everything that I've put on the screen so far has been a haiku. The haikus, this talk is not the very first time that I messed with haikus. About 2 years ago, I was going to Tokyo for a month, and one of my best friends gave me a big dare, and it's registered in the following haikus. Right before my trip, my friend gave me a challenge. Come on, who does that? He said, in Japan, write a haiku every day. Fucker, I'll write 2. And so every day that I was there, I was writing haikus, not about nature and the things that haikus are actually used to be written about, but about my experience there and the places that I used to go. For example, 3 lines, no way, son. I need pages to explain robot restaurant. It's just a toilet, but one day I'll press all these buttons, then run fast. Some nights feel special. I'd buy drinks for the whole bar if I knew how to. Call me old-fashioned, but I just mailed a postcard like a damn pilgrim. Traveling, at worst, an expensive reminder that home is cool too. And these are 5 out of 60-some haikus that I had at the end of my time there. And when I got back, I thought, okay, what can I do with all these things? And maybe I'll just pair them with the photos I took there. And I published a book. The title is also a haiku. It's called Admitted Japan. You love when a foreigner struggles with chopsticks. If it wasn't for that dare that I got, I wouldn't have something that I can hang on to after that month. So the luckiest thing that you can ever get if you're trying to get a project, or if you assume that one day you get a project, is get a challenge, dare to do something. So to recap, earmuffs NSA, freedom is overrated. Get some constraints, whether you give them to yourself, or if you're lucky, get them from someone else. Go get creating, guys. Thank you. I have time for one question. I also have time for 0 questions if you guys don't have any questions. You got no? One. Yes.
Tell us about your background and where you got started.
I got started as a graphic designer. Went to school for advertising. Ended up taking some classes in graphic design. Ended up with enough credits to go for a double major, and have been in advertising since. Worked for a few years in Kansas City, worked for 8 years here in Leo Burnett, Chicago, and have been freelancing for the last 1.5 years. Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Hey everyone, thanks for waking up early in the morning. I'm really bad at it, so I appreciate your time and your effort. So today we're gonna dive right into this. We're gonna talk about what it's like to think like a fighter pilot. And just to get this out of the way right off the bat, I'm not a fighter pilot. I've never flown a plane. I'm not even a commercial pilot. I actually couldn't even speak to a pilot when I was putting this together, because every time you contact an Air Force base, they send you, it's like a bunch of like phone tag while goose chasing, and you can't get anyone on the phone. But I did a lot of research, and I'm going to kind of like talk you through how to think like a fighter pilot today. Like Jen said, I'm a designer at Digital McKinsey. It's really interesting. I just started there like a few months ago. If you want to talk to me about what it's like to work here, we're hiring. So come find me after I get off the stage. And what's really interesting about the way that fighter pilots think is it happens in only a few seconds. The way that the design process usually happens is it's drawn out over the course of many months. But when you're a pilot up at 30 or 36,000 feet, and there's a guy behind you trying to shoot you out of the sky, you don't have weeks to post-it note your way to a solution. You kind of just have to make it happen immediately, or else you die. So fighter pilots have kind of a different approach, and there's a lot that designers can learn from it. And to start to unpack that, we can look at the directives of pilots and the directives of the designers and compare and contrast them, right? So a pilot needs to understand his enemy or her enemy and the tactics that they're going to employ in order to come up with a winning strategy to either not die or tactfully disengage from combat in the air, right? So you need to know, if your pilot is Korean, what do they teach Korean pilots, and like what kind of planes do Koreans fly, and like what is Korean culture like, and how does that all play into the decision they're going to make. Designers, on the other hand, we need to understand our users, not our enemies, and their behaviors, not their tactics, in order to create successful products, experiences, advertisements, whatever it is we're making. There's a lot of empathy involved there, right? So there's this really interesting contrast between understanding enemies and understanding users that designers put designers at odds with pilots in a way, but the thing that brings both of these disciplines together is that we both frequently work with incomplete information, right? Like designers and pilots are both masters of taking very ambiguous situations, like a creative brief that's unconstrained, for example, and bringing it to a more concrete place that's more resolved feeling, right? So a lot of times, when you're a designer working digitally, you'll get a brief that's like, we need a new app. But it's wholly ambiguous, right? Like you have to start to talk to people and define what the problem actually is. Same with pilots. When they're in a cockpit, you can't see the world around you. There's a lot of information you don't have about who is flying around you, and you need to kind of figure out how to solve that problem. And we know as designers the premier tools for taking things from an ambiguous place to a concrete place are analysis and synthesis. And pilots also engage in analysis and synthesis in a way that to me is totally fascinating. Like Jen was saying, OODA loops, it's super cool. The reason there are snowmobiles up here is because the colonel who invented the OODA loop thought process, his name is John Boyd, you should totally look him up. The way he would explain analysis and synthesis is actually with the snowmobile example. So he would say, imagine you're skiing on a ski slope, imagine you're riding an outboard motorboat, imagine you like just bought a bike for your kid, like a little toy bike, and imagine that you are, that you're driving a tank. And he'll say when you break those things down, when you analyze them, you can take the treads, because you've broken the tank down into its parts, you can take the treads from the tank, the handlebars from the bike, the outboard motor from the motorboat, the skis from the ski slope, and you put all those things together and you get a snowmobile. And it's totally different, has nothing to do with any of the things that we just talked about, but when you engage in analysis, break things down, and you build them back up using synthesis, you get to something new and different. And a pilot's process for doing this is called an OODA loop. OODA is an abbreviation, we'll break it down in a minute. OODA loops, really what they do is they slow your thought process down. They delay your action, they delay your instinctual action. So, when you're a pilot, you're trained to kind of like do all this muscle memory stuff. OODA loops are a tool that allow you to think about a situation structurally and prevent you from using your instincts to potentially make the wrong decision. They actually introduce friction into your thought process, which is very different from the design process, which is supposed to kind of lubricate your thought process and make you be more creative and make things flow. The OODA loop actually is very intentional about like stop, take a moment and observe the world around you. So it's a 4-step process, and to kind of illustrate this process, there's a really amazing story. I don't know if any of you listen to the Planet Money podcast, but if you don't, you should. They did an episode recently about spies. So there's the story they tell is there's this spy in South America. He's on a train going to meet an informant, and he has his phone on him, and he's sitting in a subway, and a guy comes over to him and says, "Give me your phone." And if you're a CIA person on a train and someone says, "Give me your phone," your first instinct is to like bust out some Krav Maga, kick that guy's ass, and go about your day. But by engaging in an OODA loop process, the agent actually did something very unexpected. So he looked around him, he observed the environment, and he noticed that there were a ton of CCTV cameras all over the place. So he knows right away, if I do something that isn't expected from a normal civilian, it's going to be on video, right? He also observed that the guy who was asking for his phone kind of looked a little disheveled. He hadn't showered in a few days, was probably homeless or poor, and was just kind of mugging him. So he knows from orienting himself to the situation that he's probably not going to surrender his phone to another intelligence agent from another operation. So after observing and orienting himself to the situation, he makes a very curious decision. He decides to do nothing and let himself get mugged without giving his phone up. So he lets the person who says, "Give me your phone," he lets him headbutt him, and he starts bleeding from his head, and he just kind of sits on the train and lets the situation subside, gets off the train, and goes to the ER. So, in a situation where normally you would be inclined to, physically engage someone and resolve the situation in a more conflict-oriented way, he actually played the long game, didn't expose himself or blow his cover, but that took doing a very unnatural thing, letting yourself get headbutted by someone on a train. So this process is so similar to the design process. I think this is kind of a natural question to ask. What if OODA was a design process? How would it work? And they're extremely similar. They're both based on iteration. They're both based on analysis and synthesis. They both go from ambiguity to clarity. And the phases even line up, right? So like observation is about understanding. Orientation is about definition of the problem. Making decisions is about designing. It's actually like, the history of the word design. And then act is about deliver. So there's actually a very, very direct parallel between these two processes, and they're extremely similar. But the interesting thing is what we can learn from their differences. So I'm going to talk about 3 differences between these processes. And they're more provocations to kind of talk to you about how you can do more, like challenge your own work, right? So the first provocation is that we only iterate in design. We spend all this time doing research the way we know, and we do synthesis the way we know, and then we get to the design phase and we get really excited because we finally get to iterate. But I would challenge that. I think there are a lot of opportunities to iterate in research and in definition in the way you do things, right? So here's an example. When I was at Moment, we actually built a little web app that lets you tap into the labor pool at Mechanical Turk and have people test websites that aren't live yet, and you can A/B stuff. We tested with like 400 people overnight for under $100. So when you push or think about or constrain yourself and you say like, how can we do this in days or minutes instead of weeks, you can be creative and actually come up with really interesting solutions. And then also this other one, I'm a big fan of retrospectives. If you've never done a retrospective, I think it's an artifact of the Agile process, really. But taking a moment after each part of your process, after you do research, after you do synthesis or a workshop, after you deliver, to sit down with your team and say, what went well, what didn't go well, how can we fix it, as opposed to doing one big retro or just like going and like having a big team party and talking about the project at the end. It'll actually help you iterate on each step of your process and improve as you move forward and move through this and do it again. Another big difference is that the OODA loop, this is, I think, so fascinating. The OODA loop is supposed to be executed entirely non-verbally in a non-communicative way. It's supposed to happen in your brain in like 2 seconds. The design process actually exists to almost to induce or force collaboration between people. So there are a lot of, that difference. We're doing one process to kind of involve people and be collaborative, and one process so that we can think and come to a conclusion without having to talk or to anyone or justify anything. There's a lot to learn here and unpack, right? But a couple of things that I would posit is chunking projects and teams into smaller pieces, and this goes beyond team size, right? This goes into things like delegating tasks. So instead of collaborating a problem to death and having everyone work on everything together so that we all feel like we're a part of the solution, maybe we assign people tasks, they break out, we do some divergent exploration, and we come together to assess or analyze what it is that everyone has made individually. So breaking apart and coming back together is very, very powerful. Even beyond that, and I might get, you might start throwing tomatoes at me for saying this, but like not this yet, but doing presentations in tools that constrain the amount of choices you have forces you to work faster. And like doing presentations or mock-ups in PowerPoint does that. You can't change leading in PowerPoint. You can't adjust kerning in PowerPoint. You can't use there's so many tools you don't have at your disposal, and it constrains your choices and forces you to make faster decisions. And this one's really interesting too, support systems that promote autonomy, not dependence. A lot of times at your job, you'll hear like, oh, we're so supportive, you're gonna have 8 bosses and they're all gonna support you individually. And every time you make a decision, that means you have to go to 8 bosses so that they can support you. And I haven't really figured out how to do this, but empowering people so that they can actually be independent instead of dependent on you is critical and really important. And then finally, we don't always take the time to orient ourselves. So, what I really mean by this is asking ourselves why we're making decisions and questioning ourselves and making sure that the decisions we make actually relate to the directive. And it's not just like, oh, it's purple because I like purple, which is a great color, by the way, nothing against purple. But you ask yourself why you're making certain decisions. Is it because you saw it on Dribbble or Pinterest and it looks great? Or is it because your client is going to be receptive to this certain color or this certain fidelity of output, and that's actually going to help you advance your argument, right? So thinking about the underlying cause behind why you're doing what you're doing, and then also building in time for personal reflection in your own process, just like go for a walk, disconnect from your work. Think about, why am I making the decisions that I'm making, or like, why am I why do I have 45 artboards in Illustrator? Is it like, just take a second to like consider and be intentional and present with your process instead of just working to get it done, which happens a lot of times with crazy deadlines, right? So these three things, iterating everywhere in our process, being able to fly solo sometimes, and taking time to orient, these are, I think, really critical nuggets that we can kind of take from the difference between how pilots think and how designers think. But there's actually one bigger takeaway, for me at least, and this is that as designers, as a field, we're very instinctual, and we're encouraged to rely on our instincts, especially if you hire. Like when I hire designers, I hear this all the time. People will say, oh, great instincts. And it's sort of to say like, oh, like they kind of like have it, or whatever that is, right? But I'd like to actually challenge this notion a little bit. And if a pilot at 36,000 feet with someone right behind them, like guns loaded, ready to shoot them out of the sky, can take like 2 seconds to engage in some structured thought, then designers sitting in Aeron chairs in like the 31st floor of a beautiful conference building with like 5 different programs open on a $4,000 computer, we can also take a few seconds or minutes to engage in structured thinking, no matter how fast our process is moving. And I think this is really that's the biggest takeaway. Thanks.
There is time for one question.
All the way in the back.
I have to know, how did you come up with this talk? Was it over time? You're like, wow, pilots are really like designers.
Yeah, this book. Read this book. It's John Boyd's biography. It's short, it's well written, and it's so interesting. This one person was responsible for he flew planes in the Korean War. He figured out pretty much on his own with stolen computer time from the Pentagon that planes fly using, the way a plane flies and its performance is determined by its ability to gain and lose energy, not by its top speed or fuel capacity. He then worked within the Pentagon's bureaucracy for like the rest of his career after he was a pilot to basically with like 2 or 3 other people, design the F-15 and F-16, which are the most successful fighter jets that have ever been created by a wide margin. And he also, the coolest part is he was known as 42nd Boyd because he had a standing challenge to any pilot. If we go up into the sky in simulated air-to-air combat, I'll shoot you down, I'll win in under 40 seconds, and he never lost. So, well, so I was reading this. Fair. So I was reading this, and he actually wrote, it talks about this paper he wrote called Destruction and Creation, where he talks about analysis and synthesis, and this moment of understanding where he's like, if you just like break things down and then put them back together, everything makes more sense. And there was a moment when I read that and it was like, oh, this is like exactly what I get paid to do every day. There's probably a connection here. So I started doing more research. I looked up all of his presentations that he gave at the Pentagon about this topics are declassified and like on websites that are, transparently look like they've been designed in 1998 and probably were. But if you Google it, there's like tons of PDFs to read and check out about him. So that's how I made the connection. Thank you.
Hey guys, good morning. So I'm Marta. I work at IDEO and we're generally associated with design thinking. I'm here to talk about design fiction, or how to spark creativity by changing context, specifically from the present to the future. So your typical project might be a couple years out, but what do you do when you get to 20 years, 50? How do you research the future? Design fictions are a kind of speculative design, and they often take the form of stories, videos, installations. Remember, this is the breakfast scene in 2001, A Space Odyssey. So if you've seen it, when you see this scene, you focus on the astronauts' journey, their distance and isolation from Earth, and not quite so much on this tablet-like object where they're getting their morning news. Your reaction is about the plot, not the object's features, how it works. It's something that lives and makes sense in this world. So in this way, a design fiction includes its own context, shaping the narrative that you experience. My background is in anthropology. The study of culture addresses a number of topics: sex, murder, really exhaustively detailed kinship charts, such as this one, that type of thing. Through ethnography, we learn about people by immersing ourselves in their lives. It's often, the field is associated with these faraway places, but it's also the basis of a lot of user-centered methodology. Ethnography is really great at assessing what's currently going on. So it provides a really rich understanding of the present and even the past. But what do you do when you need to get yourself to design for a world that doesn't exist yet, or there's only glimmers of it out there? How are you going to do this? Beyond anthropology, I'm inspired by architect and designer Eliel Saarinen's reminder that we should always design a thing in its next larger context. So chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. The future, in a way, is the next largest context to the present, and we'll get at it through design fictions. Here's 4 ways in which shifting context through design fictions can also help us design for the future. I'll start with, hey, why not just go to the future right now? And then we'll talk about analogies, storytelling, and even argument. The future is unevenly distributed in the present. You can put yourself in the context of your own design fiction by looking out in the world for versions of it. It's a novel way to go to a place where the future and now. So to give an example, in a project about the future of driving, we went to Korea because there's a lot of investment in infrastructure that created this awareness of transportation and energy choices among the people that we could interview. We also asked participants to draw on the context of their own lives in order to explore what shape transportation might take. So here you see snapshots from 2 people who work as drivers in shipping and delivery in Seoul. We played them a short design fiction narrative. You can see the video in the corner over there about how a day on the job might look like in the future, and asked them to build and edit with us based on their experience. You can also look for analogies to the elements of your design fiction or the types of objects within this. We often talk about this example internally of the Apple mouse, and here you see a sketch from one of the patents. So the idea was inspired by, and I'm quoting here, by an Atari arcade roller ball flipped upside down so that the ball faced downwards. That design dramatically reduced the complexity required to build the device and brought its price down to realistic consumer levels. So this is the sort of the taking apart and putting back together like Daniel was just talking about. Analogies can give you ways to stretch and reconsider your problem space and how others solved problems that might be somewhat similar but somewhat different than your own. You see it beyond products as well. You hear like, it's the Uber of this, it's the Tinder of that, and in human needs and desires as well. So one of our teams went to see a psychic to kind of reconsider what are people's hopes when they're seeking out market research. And another went to a dance class as a metaphor for partnership in finance. You can also act out the future through immersive storytelling. Your research can populate the world of the design fiction with stories from the field. Another example for you guys, this is Concept Kitchen 2025, which was a project by IKEA, IDEO, and Lund and Eindhoven universities. Students and participants both had an aversion to food waste. In the meantime, one of the technological signals they had noticed out in the world was the potential availability and lowered cost of drone delivery. So together, both of these signals were expressed in the project, but again, the drone wasn't at the center of the narrative. Rather, the project highlighted the emotional benefits of not feeling guilty about wasting food, not cooking, and expressed it in the physical design through this small but visible storage. The future is about potential. It's not about prediction. You're probably gonna get it wrong if you predict it. So it's up to you to argue it out. By comparing and contrasting the reactions that viewers or creators of the design fiction have to that world, you can learn more about how to move your design forward and the world that it lives in. In an augmented realities workshop, which I think a couple of you were at actually, we supplied participants with prompts. There was images with space to annotate and cards with actions and emotion statements on them in order to spark more conversation. With the raw materials to form a design fiction, people began taking those first steps into delineating those worlds. They took their context, the context of their lives as designers and activists, and funneled it into these potential futures. They definitely didn't agree on everything. So one of the debates we had was replicating travel experiences for low-income communities, would that alleviate or exacerbate inequality? How would status, that social capital of having traveled to an exotic locale, translate to the virtual experience of a place? Was there maybe a right or movement to travel that could be undercut? Design fictions encourage multiple viewpoints to shape how they are interpreted and expressed. The openness of this speculative form invites fearless experimentation and curiosity. So I invite you to do the same in your own practice using these four prompts that I described, to find the next largest context in the world, in your work, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. Or at least your own version of an early morning breakfast in space. Any takers for the one question? Shout it out. Yeah, sure. So I'm building and responding on a lot of great work from a lot of people in and out of IDEO. As far as kind of thinking about how your thing connects to other things in a system, that's the great, the benefit of placing a product or an interaction into a future world, because then you should ask yourself, what is it like socially? What is the culture? What are the economics? How is tech expressing itself there? So in thinking of those parameters of the world, it pushes you towards systems thinking, whether you kind of intended to do it or not. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.